Eric.
Omar.
What's going on, man?
I tell you what, what's going on is that we're doing it better than everybody else. And I don't say that lightly. Mm-hmm. I say that with authority, but also with humbleness and charity, because I was listening to the last couple episodes of the podcast that shall not be named,
right?
Associated with Macrofactor.
The Macrofactor
and I
podcast.
say that.
Yep.
Yeah, I didn't want to say it because people see it as a petty shot, but it's honestly just an apt description.
Yep.
So anyway, I was listening to Stronger by Science. We'll go ahead and say it. And I noticed that they have, unsurprisingly, started having an actual commercial as part of their, not just like, the typical old school muscle magazine where you're like, oh, I'm learning all about this interesting supplement. You realize it's actually an ad by Muscle Tech, and they've bought out, 1/3 of the magazine.
Yep.
Not the subversive trick you into thinking you're learning something, but you're actually just becoming indoctrinated into getting the Macrofactor app. But no, a legitimate external advertiser. And at first I was like, of course, it started to fuel my cynicism. But next thing I know, I was like, actually, damn it, this is a good advertiser. It was for the Sports Nutrition Association.
Yeah.
And for those who don't know, Sports Nutrition Association is a new body that I'm a part of. I'm on the board. So is Dr. Eric Trexler. So is a lot of other great people we've had on the podcast, academics in the field, and practitioners. And it's trying to do some really good work. So I thought what we could do, Omar, is do an unpaid advertising spot on this episode for SNA, just to show that we're far more virtuous than Stronger by Science. I don't know how you feel about that.
Yeah, we don't even have to say it outright like that we are more virtuous. The act itself indicates our position. So, of course, and this was something we had already had planned. I think they probably caught wind of that, and they found a way to monetize it, which is unsurprising once again. But nonetheless, let's carry forward with the plan that we've had for quite some time, Eric, of not being compensated and shouting out a good organization.
100%. So big shout out to the Sports Nutrition Association. I can only anticipate that this logo is someone who is trying to run over and spot someone else.
Yep.
I'm not sure any other reason why you would run. I did not approve this logo, but nonetheless, Sports Nutrition Association, big shout out. I think the selling point here, if people are interested in why is this something they should do, is that Alex and the team have gone to extreme lengths to make sure that the course content and curriculum really covers all the bases for a nutritionist, so that they actually have underwriting from an insurance company that provides far more coverage than your typical personal trainer or nutrition certification holder can have. So they're actually protected in this space, which is an important thing because things are becoming more and more litigious. Yep. In the modern realm. So not only is it just really, really good education, and I've had my hand in being basically the peer reviewer, if you will, of all the content, but it is also something I think is becoming increasingly important, just to make sure that you do a little CYA from a liability perspective. And scope of practice is something we have talked about in Iron Culture. So it is really important. I'll leave it there. And also, just to one-up Stronger by Science even more, we're going to do a second free, unpaid ad.
Boom.
I don't even think the NASM, the National Academy of Sports Medicine, knows that I'm doing this because they're that big of an organization. So we're not even getting anything out of this.
Sure.
They're not even going to know that I did this on Iron Culture because I'm just one of like 40 contributors to this new certification they have. So anyway, NASM just launched, I think, last month, the Bodybuilding and Physique Coach certification, which is really cool. And this was headed up by Dr. Guillermo Escalante, who is one of the 10 other people in the bodybuilding space who does research and is also a competitor and a coach. And he curated basically the who's who of academics and practitioners in the space. So we're talking Brad Schoenfeld, Eric Trexler, Lauren Conlin, myself, Scott Stevenson, Brandon Roberts, Brad Dieter. You probably heard some of these names if you've been following along. Dr. Jesse Stapleton, ton of people. And that's just honestly a third of the people who popped in my head. Joey Munoz, there's more. Adam Gonzalez, Darren Willoughby. There's so many PhDs involved in this project that it'll just make you smarter by being in proximity to it. But it is a 6-section, 19-chapter course that I kick off in chapter 2, introducing physique sport, the history. Who peer reviewed the history that I wrote, folks?
Connor Heffernan.
Dr. Connor Heffernan, of course. it doesn't stop. So not only did I write that chapter where I talked about the relevance of the history, how that influences the modern sport, the culture, and the experiences that athletes go to today, the landscape of modern competitive bodybuilding, non-competitors, scope of practice, the risks of being involved, informed consent like we've talked about. But I also discussed the basis of evidence-based practice to kind of underpin everything else that comes in the rest of the book. And I also peer-reviewed the nutrition, training, and peaking chapters to make sure that the actual X's and O's are something that are Helm stamped approved right there. So no, it was a huge pleasure and privilege to be a part of it. And big shout out to NASM, led by Brian, Casey, and have me on, as well as Dr. Escalante. So anyway, if you're interested, definitely check out that course. Kai will have the link in the description to both the Sports Nutrition Association as well as that NASM course. And yeah, we're making literally nothing off of this.
Yeah.
I mean, of course, I was paid to be a part of NASM and SNA, but this ad placement is an ad, but it comes purely out of the depths of our soul and heart.
So we're not being compensated for that. And what you're saying, Eric, is that course goes helms deep in terms of everything one needs to know. I have to say that it is a minor conflict of interest, and then we'll begin. Martin, I'm so glad to see you. And that is, NASM did pay me many moons ago. They do know who I am. And many people would promote, if you're a fitness influenza, you promote things like a scale that's arbitrary and just like any other scale, or some sort of insert ABC product, like some sort of herb. I decided to go for some unknowable reason with promoting a training certification. And it's one of three things that I chose to support because I did believe in it, being a trainer and how rigorous it was. And we have something called, I don't feel like getting sued here, but I'll just say that there is a training organization, the largest body in Canada, that at the time when I took it, when I was a late teenager being certified as a personal trainer, it was not rigorous in the slightest. And so I got a chance to preview NASM, the personal training course certification. So it's one of the three things that I stood behind in my 12 years being on YouTube. So it's funny how it goes full circle. Speaking of that journey, Eric, I want to say, Martin, I'm very glad to see you. You know why?
Why? Tell me.
Point to first, you're a hunk, but that's an obvious one. So we'll skip to the second one. I have realized, and I told Eric this off air, that you are, I don't know if you're the 6th, 7th, 8th, I don't know what amount, but there is a new wave of folks in academia that are doing the damn thing, that are getting their PhDs, that are educating the next generation, that started maybe 6-7 years ago. I don't know where, like, you first started in the fitness space, but you're in it. Like, I see the people that you follow and so forth, and you're paying it forward. And I do want to say that I am a jaded individual, just in general. That's me, okay? Allow me to be me. But when I look at YouTube sometimes, I do see a wasteland in the sense of what's the next generation, what's happening, who's being influenced, who has the largest platform. But Eric has brought forth, we're going to name this very quickly. I think Martin might be number 8, but let's name some of them. We have Kedrick, we had Alexander Colliari Turner, we had Pac, we had Zach from Data Driven Strength, we had Alyssa, we had Yvonne, we had Martin now, so that would be 7. Who am I missing? Milo, 8. So I'm not even kidding. It is refreshing to see. It is refreshing to see the new generation. I am coining that because you guys are, getting your PhDs or having just completed it. You've been in the space for several years and you're operating at the highest level and you're carrying that proverbial torch. And I do think, I'll just say this very briefly, being a jazz enthusiast, and this is very serious, there wasn't that succession of people due to a wide variety of factors, that the tutelage that's necessary of the years, the 30, 40 years of accumulated experience one has to pass on properly. And any skill or any craft, of which being an educator is certainly one of them, having kind of that directed line where there are people that you can look up to, that you can, speak with, so on and so forth, and learn those necessary skills to pay it forward. It's crucial. So I just love to see it, and that is me being serious. I'm going to go back to being cynical for the rest of the podcast, but I am glad to see you.
Awesome. It really is a privilege to be here. Although you guys have probably wasted about 10 minutes of my time so far.
Thank you.
I've been really just sitting here waiting to say something. But yeah, all honesty, really a privilege to be here talking to you guys today. And yeah, that's what I do. I try my best to pay it forward, and I'm looking forward to having this discussion today.
Oh, we're going to waste far more than 10 minutes of your time, my friend.
Okay.
The goal is for most of our guests to feel obligated to come back on because we're a reasonably noteworthy podcast somehow, but to really want to say no. So that is the goal. And no, but in all seriousness, for those who don't know, we have PhD candidate over at Deakin University, Martin Refalo, with us. He's also, would you call yourself the Chief Science Officer of JPS Health and Fitness?
Yeah, I'm the education manager there. Almost, a similar role to what you would say a chief science educator does, though.
Well, I like Chief Science Officer because
Science officer,
Star Trek. It's
Right,
awesome.
right.
And no, but in all seriousness, JPS Health and Fitness, they're doing great work out in Melbourne, not only physically where they're located, but also just in the online space. They do a lot of great mentoring, and you can tell anyone who has been, I'm going to say touched by JPS Health and Fitness, but I mean that in the sense that there was consent on all sides for any touching that occurred. But their spirit was touched, and you can see that they come alive and they feel like they've learned a lot. So you are just, you're a small but very important part of that, because I know that the folks over at JPS Health and Fitness, it truly is a community. And it's been just great working with you guys and having been doing so now for, like 6 years. And also, I just want to say it is an honor and privilege to be part of your supervisory team, along with the other, obviously Jackson Fife leading the charge, Lee Hamilton overseeing the whole thing. So I'm an external supervisor for those who are curious on Martin's project. But Martin, it's been really awesome to see you work through your PhD. I guess we're in mid stages now, not really early stages, but you're doing a great job, and it's such an interesting topic. So if you could briefly just tell us a little more about yourself and about why you got into doing a PhD and what you hope to answer with your research questions.
Totally. So yeah, thanks for all that, Eric. I've been working in the industry probably since I was 17. That's when I first got a job working out of my local gym, which was known for just bodybuilding. So it's been a long time, and I've probably been coaching for the past 8 or so years, and the last 5 have been at JPS Health and Fitness. And like you said, I am the education manager there. So at JPS, we do a lot of education work. Not only do we coach clients face to face and online, but we run a lot of education seminars, and that's something that I'm highly involved in and something that I love doing. That's probably the best part of my job, is being able to learn things and then pass them on to others. So we run a lot of national and even international seminars, which, is awesome. And like I said, that is the best part of my job. So I've also completed a bachelor's degree in exercise science and a master's degree in exercise science too. And I've recently moved on to a PhD. And I guess the main reason that I've wanted to do that is to just improve my understanding of certain topics. And I'm really interested in ideas that have stood the test of time. And I think, training hard is one of those ideas. Like, we all intuitively know we need to train hard to build muscle. And so as part of my PhD, I wanted to explore that a little further. And that's what I'm currently doing, like you mentioned. So about halfway through my PhD. And it really is an honor to be working with, people like you, guiding me throughout the process, and I guess teaching me how to think scientifically and how to improve the quality and the reliability of, research studies looking at resistance training outcomes. So that really is my main goal with the PhD, is to not only improve my understanding and be able to pass that on, but to be able to improve research and the interpretation of research and the way in which we discern practical applications from the research, and then look to employ that with our clients or on ourselves to get better results. So that's really my end game, and I'm still in the early stages of that journey, of course. And yeah, I'm really looking forward to publishing research, but also teaching people just how to think about fitness-related ideas in an improved way, and how to interpret research in an improved way, so that we can discern those practical applications that will help us get better results in the long run.
Well said, Martin. I love it. And I think, improving one's ability to think and ask better questions is not only something that, of course, needs to happen for academics and the pursuit of knowledge, but it's far more important that it happens at the practical level where we're actually working with people. And each individual has a very unique context, and the decisions one has to make in the trenches have direct impacts on someone's life. So, yeah, I think speaking of thinking better, this isn't even a fitness error. This is a human error that we always make, is we tend to dichotomize things that don't actually operate as a dichotomy. They operate as a spectrum. And I think in the space of training, one of the most frequently dichotomized to our own decrement for understanding topics is training to failure or not training to failure. And we actually brought this up a little bit when we had, just in our last episode, we were talking with Dr. Patroklos and Androulakis Korakakis, the recent doctor. And he worked with Dr. James Steele, fantastic researcher, has been around a long time, and he did he was mentored into doing some of the earliest work and is now continuing to do a lot of work on what actual failure, quote unquote, means, and understanding it better. And I brought up that, if we go all the way back to Arthur Jones, the inventor of not only the Nautilus machines, but also high intensity training, this is kind of the inception point where we really started to see this divergence in philosophies that was carried throughout in the bodybuilding sector by Mike Mentzer, then Dorian Yates. And you still see it today, this false dichotomy between volume and intensity being proximity to failure. And I think it is really good work that you're doing, because you're saying, hey, if we want change, you got to be the change. And instead of just comparing failure versus non-failure, maybe we need to think about failure in all its different definitions, have some unifying terms and terminology, and acknowledge that it is not a black or white thing. So talk to me about the rationale for, we'll start with the first publication that came out of your PhD, the scoping review.
Right. So yeah, my primary area of research is muscle hypertrophy, and specifically, I want to know more about how proximity to failure during resistance training influences muscle hypertrophy, like you said, Eric. Now, upon reading a lot of the literature surrounding this topic in the earlier stages of my PhD, it became quite obvious that there were many research gaps that needed to be filled. So there has been a lot of work done in this area. There are, multiple research studies that have compared failure training versus non-failure training, or have indirectly compared different proximities to failure. And there are also multiple meta-analyses that have looked at the aggregate result of, multiple studies combined. But even when looking through the totality of that literature, it still seems like there are improvements that can be made. And that was my main goal, and still is a main goal of mine. By no means have I accomplished that goal. There still is a lot of work to do, but I think we're on our way to elucidating a better understanding of this topic. So one of the main issues that starts to arise when you look at the available literature that examines the influence of proximity to failure on muscle hypertrophy is that there is variability and at times ambiguity in the way the term failure is defined. And this is a common critique of the literature. Like, we hear this a lot. People say that, participants in studies don't train to true failure, or, we don't have a robust definition of failure. And that is definitely the case. And one of my main goals is to try and fill that research gap. So with the scoping review, what we did is we systematically searched for all the studies that were relevant, right, that looked at how proximity to failure may influence muscle hypertrophy. And instead of trying to group them all together and come to a conclusion about all studies in one big group, we actually categorized the studies into specific themes based on the definition of set failure that was applied in each of the studies and the research question asked. So when you do that, all of a sudden things start to become a lot clearer. So, essentially across the literature, we have three themes of studies. We have a theme of studies that applies an objective definition of failure. And it's a definition that is in line with what we call momentary muscular failure. And this is what people generally think about when they use the term failure. It's momentary muscular failure. So it's the point where, despite attempting to do so, an individual is unable to complete the concentric portion of their current repetition with a full range of motion. Right? That's what we think when we use the term failure. But not every study employs that definition. So we do have some studies that employ it, and it's important to look at those studies individually and not compare them to other studies that also supposedly use a definition of failure, but it may be a definition of failure that is more so in line with volitional failure, which permits individuals to terminate sets on their own accord, or potentially even when a repetition maximum is prescribed, which also is not synonymous with momentary muscular failure. So in some studies, they prescribe a certain set and repetition scheme, but we can't really tell someone to do 3 sets of 10 to momentary muscular failure. It doesn't really work that way. So in theme A, where we have studies that do employ the definition of momentary muscular failure, there's actually no set predetermined repetition number that participants have to aim for, because it's simply an involuntary point of set termination. So that really is the key difference between studies in what we call theme A, which do employ the definition of momentary muscular failure, which is again the most objective way we can define failure both in research and practice. We then have theme B, which involves studies that employ various other definitions of failure, and in some cases the actual definition is not explicitly stated in the research paper, which is in itself a critical limitation. And we also have another theme of studies which are sometimes underrepresented in these discussions. It's a theme of studies that utilize a velocity-based method of set termination, otherwise known as velocity loss. So, for example, we can calculate the percentage of lifting velocity that a participant may experience from their first repetition. So what is the magnitude of velocity loss that an individual experiences from their first repetition? And we can actually get a participant, we can prescribe a set percentage of velocity loss that we are going to be terminating sets at. So for example, Eric, if I prescribed you to a 40% velocity loss and Omar, you trained to a 20% velocity loss, maybe I trained to a 10% velocity loss, our proximities to failure would be different. Eric, you'd be training closer to failure than Omar and I would be if we were using the same relative load and performing the same exercise. So essentially in this theme of studies, we aren't directly comparing failure versus non-failure training, but we're indirectly comparing different proximities to failure. And it's important to know that in some cases in these velocity loss studies, especially when we're employing a high velocity loss, the participants actually sometimes reach momentary muscular failure as well. So these studies are quite reliable, and we can discern the influence of proximity to failure on muscle hypertrophy from these studies as well. So it's important to zoom out when we're looking at the relevant literature and identify how each of these studies fit into different themes, again, based on the definition of failure applied and the research question asked. So, like I said, there is a lot of literature on this topic, and many of the studies that have assessed the influence of proximity to failure in muscle hypertrophy, they've come to a similar conclusion that the meta-analyses do. So, two meta-analyses from Gergich and Schoenfeld, and even from Vieira in 2021, they reported similar findings to what we've recently reported, both in our meta-analysis and in the scoping review as well. It's just that I think our findings are of a higher validity and reliability than previous findings because we have tried to fill some of these key research gaps. So with the initial scoping review, because we weren't able to come to a statistical conclusion, it was more so a conservative interpretation of all the studies in each theme. And we tried to explore the individual effect of each of these studies and, like I said, come to a conservative conclusion. From there, though, the goal was to move on to the recent meta-analysis and try to come to a statistical conclusion about how proximity to failure may influence muscle hypertrophy within each of the themes that we identified. And again, the results we came to, they're not necessarily novel, but they're novel in the sense that I think the validity and the reliability of the findings is higher than some of the previous research. So, for example, when it comes to just looking at individual studies, a common limitation of just looking at individual studies is statistical power, right? So for those who don't know, the statistical power of a study is essentially directly related to the sample size. So low sample sizes usually equal a low statistical power. And this is really important to know because a low statistical power can increase the chances of a type 2 error. And this is known as a false negative result. So you might not pick up on a result that is actually there if you have a low sample size and thus a low statistical power. So what we're trying to do when we meta-analyze studies is we try and increase our statistical power by combining all these studies together and essentially increasing our total sample size, right? And that's why we've gone on to do now a meta-analysis. But like I said, there have been previous meta-analyses that have also taken this approach. But the limitation within those meta-analyses is that they have actually grouped all these relevant studies together and have almost disregarded or dismissed the variability of the definitions applied to failure across studies. Now, of course, that can be a confounding factor to the result of the meta-analysis. So what we did was we first scoped the literature to identify the 3 themes, and then we went on to meta-analyze the studies within each of these specific themes, hopefully allowing for a more valid and reliable result that is specific to the definition of momentary muscular failure, which is really what we are all concerned about when we use the term failure, right? So that's an important aspect of, I guess, our goal with our research. And again, it's not necessarily novel in the sense of the outcomes themselves, but I think the outcomes that we have determined with our research are more valid. Of course, they come with their own limitations, but they are more valid than previous research approaches that have been taken. So that's a little bit about what we are currently doing, what myself and my research team are currently doing to try and elucidate a better understanding of this topic and hopefully discern some practical applications that aren't dichotomous. So it's important to know for people listening, research studies are designed in a specific way to answer specific research questions. So researchers create these research questions, and the question isn't designed to inform how each and every one of us should all be individually programming our own training. They're simply designed to sometimes tease out a difference between 2 protocols. That's definitely the case in the topic at hand here. Researchers are trying to look at the difference between failure training and non-failure training. But in reality, we don't ever have to tie ourselves down to taking one approach over the other. We can employ various proximities to failure, and that is the, I guess, practical application that we are really trying to come to with the research that we are putting out there. So hopefully
Beautiful.
that makes sense. And yeah, that is the, I guess, the foundation of what we're trying to do.
I love it. It makes a ton of sense. And Omar, I don't know how much you have seen discussion of people who are typically, I wouldn't call them like science deniers, but who have relevant critiques of some of the research that has existed on failure. I don't know if you've seen this, but the most common one I see is, yeah, but did they really go to failure in that study? You know, if you see people in the kind of the hit camp, or, you know, some of the critiques leveled at, and I think rightfully so, like some of the higher volume studies, like, oh, really? They did 30 sets of squats, leg press, and leg extensions to failure per week. I don't buy it, you know? Omar, is that something that you see ever when you're interacting online with people?
100%, and even more devolved. That's like, let's call that like level 2. The level 1 is that dichotomy between like training to failure and not training to failure, and then the association of training to failure also being that you're training hard enough, like difficulty being one of the definitions, one of the rubrics of making progress, and one of the certain ways that we know without a shadow of a doubt that someone is training hard enough is that they're training to failure. And when someone brings up maybe some research about proximity failure and so on and so forth, they just anything that's contrary to maybe their binary choice immediately gets thrown out. So that's level 1, and then level 2 is totally like either the hit camp, or like if a study says 30 hard sets per week train to failure. The question that's like level 2, and that I think that one is a more fair critique than level 1, which is just more a personal stance, a personal bias.
Yeah, and the issue is that sometimes what they're stating, if you interact with them too, can not always like I'm gonna actually point out these are some very valid critiques and limitations, which is the whole reason why Martin's doing what he's doing. Mm-hmm. But sometimes it resembles the no true Scotsman fallacy. Like, if you say, oh, like, here's how we validated failure. Like, but how do we know that they did failure? Like, there's always a greater level of failure. Like, I recently had this interaction online where someone was like, yeah, but the average person doesn't know how to go to failure. And I said, well, these weren't average people. Like, some of these studies actually have pretty well-trained athletes. And some of the research we do, like, if you look at the average squat numbers, or if you look at the participants we have, it's there. And then sometimes we also use, velocity to validate that they actually did slow down to the point where it would be at least close to failure. And they go, and then the response to that was, well, unless you're doing forced reps, it's not failure, or unless you do drop sets or go quote unquote beyond failure, which you're not really doing. You're just going to failure again with a lighter load. It's not failure. And I'm like, okay, so we're shifting goalposts here. Gotcha. All right. So I think it's really important just to acknowledge that if we want to address this limitation, we actually have to have terminology that is clear and objective rather than something that changes. So just the fact that that we put in the work to actually differentiate between momentary muscular failure, which, by the way, speaking of terminology, having been in and around Dr. Steele and some of his colleagues like Dr. Fisher, they're actually even moving away from the momentary muscular failure component. Some of them just prefer momentary failure because we don't know what's causing failure. Is it perception, fatigue, pain, or is it actually inability to produce enough force to keep the rep going? So being more and more specific over time is always a good thing in science. But nonetheless, so I think just to give people some really good background here, sure, I've critiqued some of these critiques for being invalid and basically being a fallacy, but there are some really, really important things to be stated here. I'm aware of research that was conducted both at FAU and part of your research, Martin, where we have attempted to have people train to true momentary muscular failure and had to stop doing it because it resulted in injuries and dropouts. This happened both on the leg press in Martin's research, and it also happened with squat and bench press research, more so the squats causing the issues in Dr. Zerdos' lab. So when we have these experiences where we ask people to go to true 10 RPEs or true momentary muscular failure, and we start to see these dropouts, I think it's a valid critique that sometimes these quote-unquote volitional failure studies, no doubt they're at a very low RIR, maybe 1, 2, 3 reps from failure with hard exercises, multiple sets in trained people. But I think that is going to happen for multiple reasons. And it was also happening in practice, which is something we need to acknowledge. It's like you by yourself training without a gym buddy motivating you to go to failure is just as invalid as some participant in a study who says they've reached failure, but at least the participants in the study are getting motivated by a room full of people. And sometimes like we have that actual momentary failure definition. So I actually would propose that in general, people training to failure in studies are on average probably closer to failure than is actually occurring in the quote unquote real world or trenches, believe it or not. And that's someone who has been a bodybuilding coach for, more than a decade. Been a bodybuilder for coming up on 2 decades and has been in the research actually conducting studies where people have reached failure. So I just wanted to put that out there for people to understand. And the best thing we can do is address that limitation and actually differentiate between these things of different proximities to failure using velocity loss, volitional failure, and momentary failure, and then see if there are differences. So I think this should be celebrated as a important addition of robustness to the data and being able to actually address the limitations that are stated not only by other researchers in peer review, but also by people in the trenches. So I just want to say kudos to you for doing that. And on that note, what did you find? So what's the report in this meta-analysis? Now that we've separated, you might call them theme B, I call them the wussy studies from theme A, where they're actually going to momentary failure, the true failure studies, the only true Scotsman. Obviously, I'm expecting that there was a massive difference, and when you trained to true failure, everyone looked like Mike Mentzer at the end of the study. Yes.
Mm-hmm. Complete with the mustache.
Yes.
Mustache has grown immediately. Yes.
Yeah. So definitely keen to get into the findings now. So now that we have, I guess, the foundation, and everything that you said there makes sense, Eric. Moving on to the recent meta-analysis, which really maps on to the previous findings from not only the previous meta-analyses, but really all the individual studies as well, which came to similar conclusions. Essentially, what we did was we first analyzed all the studies together, just like previous meta-analyses have done, and we then looked at the result of a specific analysis to each theme. Now, what we found was that when analyzing all the studies together, so both theme A and theme B, including all definitions of failure, we actually did find a trivial advantage for training to set failure being superior to non-failure training for muscle hypertrophy. Now, there are some limitations to that result, so limitations surrounding the statistical approach, which are probably too much to get into today, but essentially what we did was we conducted what is known as a sensitivity analysis, which essentially means we have to replicate the given analysis multiple times with a different correlation coefficient value. Again, this is all stated in the paper, so if you want to read more about it, you definitely can. But what we found was that with the analysis of both studies in theme A and theme B, when we ran the analysis multiple times, we saw a variability in the result. So in some cases, it was a statistically significant result. In other cases, it wasn't. So this leads us to think that we really do need to interpret this complete analysis with some degree of caution. Now, that wasn't the case for our theme C analysis when we looked at all the studies employing a velocity-based method of set termination. The variability in results was very, very low when we had to repeat the analysis multiple times as part of this sensitivity analysis to essentially determine the reliability of the finding. So that's something to keep in mind when you read through the paper, and it's all explicitly stated there. And like I said, what we then went on to do is we looked at the results of just the studies in theme A, which used the definition of momentary muscular failure. And the conclusion we came to is that currently there is no evidence to support that training performed to momentary muscular failure is superior to non-failure training. Now, that means what it means. So it doesn't mean that non-failure training is better than training to failure. It doesn't mean that you would get the same results if you don't train to failure versus if you train to failure. It doesn't mean that a 3RIR is just as good as train to failure. And it doesn't mean you never have to train to failure. So these are a lot of interpretations of the research that I've heard from many other individuals that have absolutely nothing to do with the conclusion that we actually came to, which actually leaves the door open for future research to show divergent results. So we're also not saying that future research may not show some benefit to momentary muscular failure, right? Or taking all your sets to momentary muscular failure. We're just saying at this point in time, there's currently no evidence to support that taking all your sets to that point of objective failure is superior to some non-failure training. And there's limitations to how non-failure training is also conducted within the literature. So in many cases, we don't actually know how far from failure the participants in these non-failure conditions are training. In many cases, it's actually a lot further than what we would probably be training in practice. So for example, in some cases, non-failure groups are assigned to perform 50% of the possible repetitions they would otherwise perform if they were taking their training all the way to failure. That's quite far from failure. I don't think anyone in practice is keeping 50% of their repetitions in the tank. And so that's also a consideration that we need to keep in mind when analyzing literature. And this is another gap that I am going to be trying to fill in my future research by employing a repetitions and reserve approach so that we can better understand how far from failure the non-failure participants are actually terminating their sets. And if we actually have a group of participants, terminating their sets at, let's say, a 2 RIR or a 3 RIR versus 1 RIR, well, what are the results going to look like when we have that type of a study design? In fact, if we look at individual studies, there was one study by Santanioli in 2020, I believe, that actually conducted a failure versus non-failure study on trained individuals with over 4 years of training experience. So they're all quite well trained. And in this study, you can actually look at the non-failure participants and approximate how far from failure they actually were, because it was a very well-designed study. So they only had 1 to 2 reps in reserve upon completion of their sets. And again, in that study design, we don't see any statistical differences. And if you want to look at the mean differences between groups, the non-failure group actually gained slightly more muscle mass over the course of the intervention period versus the failure group. So that's one individual study we can look to try and get an idea of how things may work if we're actually pushing very close to failure, but not reaching that point of momentary muscular failure. And again, that study was conducted in resistance-trained individuals. Now, again, to kind of zoom out, so far what we have is in theme A, no evidence to support that training to momentary muscular failure is superior to non-failure training. In theme B, we also come to a similar result. So the studies that employ other definitions of failure, which probably lead to the participants reaching momentary muscular failure on some sets, but on many of the sets, they probably are just shy of failure. That still didn't seem to be picked up as a statistical difference throughout analysis. But what we see is that the effect size, when we're looking at this analysis, really did favor the set failure condition. But what I take from this is that pushing, close to failure but not to failure is probably, really good, because the results of that theme B study were different. The effect size values were different to the theme A study, and this is something that you can actually look at when you're working your way through the paper. It's just important to take that one mental step further and try to interpret the results in a way that gives you a clearer indication of what's actually happening. So in theme B, participants likely aren't pushing to failure all the time. They're probably stopping just shy from failure, especially if they've been prescribed a certain number of reps to perform. And so that gives us a bit of a clue. Well, if pushing close to failure but not to failure is probably really good. That's probably something that we should be aiming to do. And then in theme C, when we look at all studies that employ that velocity-based method of set termination, and we're indirectly comparing different proximities to failure, we start to see a similar trend. So essentially what we did in our analysis is we took all the studies that use the velocity loss method of set termination, and we looked at each of the conditions used in these studies, and we compared high velocity loss conditions. So let's say conditions that require participants to terminate their sets over a 25% velocity loss, right? Which means they're getting close to failure, and at times they're definitely reaching failure. So for example, in one study that used a 40% velocity loss, participants reached failure about 50% of the time, right? And I mean momentary muscular failure. And what we did is we compared the high velocity loss conditions to a moderate velocity loss condition, which would be in between 20 to 25% of velocity loss. So what we have here is a group of participants training very close to failure, if not hitting failure on some sets, versus a group training further from failure, but we don't exactly know what RIR the moderate velocity loss conditions would be translating to, right? We can just say they're not as close to failure as the high velocity loss conditions. And what we found there is no superiority for pushing closer to failure and reaching that high velocity loss threshold. We actually saw similar equivalent hypertrophy across both of those velocity loss conditions. And previous analyses have shown that moderate to high velocity loss conditions are likely superior to low velocity loss conditions where participants aren't getting very close to failure at all. So what this signifies to me is somewhat of a non-linear relationship between proximity to failure and muscle hypertrophy over the course of a whole session, right? That's important to keep in mind. These participants are doing multiple sets over the course of a whole session for a given muscle group. And it's important to know that all the participants in Theme C, so the velocity loss studies, were resistance trained, right? So, a common critique of the literature is that, all participants are untrained, and so we can't translate those findings to real world when we're working with trained individuals. But in the case of our analysis, out of the 15 studies that we looked at, 8 of them were in resistance trained individuals with anywhere in between 2 to 4 years of resistance training experience, sometimes even more than that. That was probably the average years of training experience. And keep in mind that researchers not only employ a criteria that involves the number of years an individual has spent training, but also a certain training frequency, and in some cases also a strength-based criteria as well that participants would need to meet to be classified as resistance trained. So when you look at the results of that analysis as a whole, you start to realize that it does map onto previous literature, and it seems to highlight this non-linear relationship between proximity to failure and muscle hypertrophy. So we have to be pushing our sets close enough to failure to stimulate the response we're after. But from that point onwards, pushing closer to failure isn't always better. So a good example of this is if we just look at how things may play out on the level of just one set. If you're just doing one set for a given muscle group in a session, pushing to failure is probably going to be your best bet. There is likely a linear effect, a linear relationship between proximity to failure and muscle hypertrophy on just the level of one set, right? So, someone commented on the article the other day on an Instagram post saying Dorian Yates wouldn't be happy with the results of this study. But I was like, well, Dorian Yates is known to do very low set volumes. And from my understanding, he's known to do, one hard set. And, if that was the case, if he's only doing one hard set for a given muscle group, it's probably in your best interest to push that all the way to failure. So the conclusions that we're coming to are relevant to the study designs that are included in the meta-analysis, which involve multiple sets over the course of a whole workout. And so the relationship between proximity to failure and muscle hypertrophy likely changes as you do more and more sets. And that's because all these variables that we implement in our programming interact with each other. So all we can say based on the results of our analysis is that currently there is no evidence to support that training to momentary muscular failure is superior to non-failure training, right? We can say that pushing closer to failure isn't always better. In some cases it is, right? When we have to meet almost a threshold point, right? So you do have to push close enough to failure to stimulate a response. Going further isn't always better. And of course, these results have to be interpreted within the context of a whole session, within the context of the individual that we're working with, and the allocation of all the other training variables that we implement within a program. And it's really important to understand that upon interpreting the results of these studies and our analysis. So our analysis wasn't set up to tell each and every one of the readers how they should individually program their own training, right? Whenever I read a study, the first thing I look at is a research question, because I want to know exactly what the researchers set out to do. And in the case of the studies that we looked at, researchers are generally setting up a study design to tease out a difference between failure training and non-failure training. But like I said earlier, in practice, we don't ever need to tie ourselves down to either one of those approaches. We should be trying to employ various proximities to failure, including failure in our own training, to try and maximize, the muscle hypertrophy that we're experiencing over time. And of course, that is dependent on many other variables. And in research, we simply can't account for all the individual variables, right? And that's not necessarily a limitation of the research itself. I think that's more so a limitation of one's interpretation of the research, right? I know that, the research questions within these study designs weren't set up to teach me how I should program for my clients. So what I'm doing upon reading these studies and upon interpreting the results of the analysis is I'm taking the pieces of information, right, that I can extract from the studies, and I'm integrating them into my understanding of how things work, to my understanding of the principles that drive the adaptations that I'm after. And they're almost just clues. The information that we extract from studies are almost just clues that help us piece the puzzle together. But of course, that puzzle looks different for each and every one of us, and we just have to account for all those individual factors. Right? So that's the way I think about the interpretation of these findings. I think that's really important, and it's almost missing in many people's interpretation of the findings of our analysis. And I think that's an important point to get across.
It's a very important point, and I think you articulated it very well, Martin. And importantly, we account for what we can account for in research. And I'm sure, Omar, you know this. We have some savvy, I won't say well-read listeners, but they're well-listened at the very least. That's the only thing I can guarantee, knowing that they're listening to Iron Culture. But I have a feeling many of them are familiar with research, and some of them are probably going, what about X, Y, and Z limitation? And just to give some credits, and also big shout out to Eric Trexler. He was a great assistance on this specific meta-analysis. So we had the statistical chops to make sure we did things appropriately. But, we did look at the influence of volume and volume load as moderating factors, which did not significantly impact the outcomes, because a savvy listener to Iron Culture would say, hold on, if I train to a 40% velocity loss and you train to a 20% velocity loss and we use the same load, sure, let's say you got 12 reps and you damn near hit failure, and I only got 6 to 7 reps or 8 reps maybe, and I'm at somewhere between a 3 to a 5 RIR, it's not only a difference in proximity to failure, you're also doing 6 more or 4 more or 5 more reps or something like that. And that is true. And it's also true that when you do studies on failure, it's very difficult to create a perfectly matched condition where the only thing differing between the groups is failure. Let's say you both want to do 10 reps and one person stops short of failure and the other person doesn't, then one person has to use a lighter load. Let's say you want to use the same load, but one person wants to stop two reps short of failure. You're doing less volume per set. Okay, well then maybe we can do an additional set to make up for the lost reps. Okay, well now you're doing an additional set. So all of these things come into play, and I think that's an important consideration for everyone listening to think about, in that failure doesn't happen in a vacuum. And that's exactly the reason why we shouldn't be thinking of it in a dichotomous manner or in these very kind of simplistic terms, is that if it doesn't happen in a vacuum, the real question should be, when and how should we utilize different proximities to failure, because they interact with things like rest, subsequent sets, additional exercises, muscle damage, and subsequent session performance, and therefore microcycle and mesocycle to mesocycle, maybe even performance, frequency of deloads, to give a call back to our last episode where Dr. Pack talked about that. So I think it's a really important thing that you stated. And you know what, folks? You got to read more than the abstract. That's ultimately, if you want to get into research, abstracts are just there to tell you whether or not this is worth your time reading. And this is, fortunately, an open access article. You can read the whole shebang. And if you really want to dive into it, I highly encourage you to check out the discussion. I think there are some really important things in there. Like, for example, if you look at surveys of bodybuilders, they're training 5 to 7 days per week, right? if you look at all of the various studies that were included in this meta-analysis, if not every single study, I want to say more than 90% of them had people training 2 or 3 times per week. So we have to realize that we can only analyze empirically the data that we have. So I'm actually really excited about the future of what's coming, the research that you're going to be conducting, the research that's coming out of Dr. Zerdos's lab with a lot of the data-driven strength folks who are still in the midst of their masters and PhDs, or at the tail end of their masters in some cases. So it's going to be a truly interesting next couple of years as we get more ecologically valid, useful comparisons that more resemble what we do in practice, so we can better uncover some of these things. But all I can say is right now, and I don't know if you agree with this, but anyone who has a really strong position on whether one should train to failure or not, that doesn't sound very nuanced, and that sounds like a one size shoe fits all, you can basically know that they're wrong.
Mm-hmm.
That's the one thing you can take home.
Yeah, I do tend to agree with that. I think I was quite disappointed that many of the critiques and comments that we received pertaining to the article, they weren't necessarily scientific critiques or disagreements. Rather, they were, I think, critiques or disagreements that were colored in personal bias and, in some cases, intellectual errors, because simply people didn't read the article, or they didn't pay enough attention to the wording that was used. So I'm very much interested in having a scientific discussion about this topic, because like you said, Eric, we're not actually sure right now. We don't have 100%, we can't come to 100%, conclusion on, what the best approach is, because it's so contextual, and we really do need more research to, I guess, elucidate this understanding further. When I say that, I'm after a scientific discussion, people might think that, science simply equals research, but I don't think that's necessarily the case. I don't think it's as easy as simply saying science equals research. I think to enter a scientific discussion and to think about these topics in a scientific way, there are a number of traits that you have to adopt and employ independent of the research. So, one of those traits is not speaking in an absolute manner, right? So science in itself is non-authoritarian, it's open-minded, it's non-absolute. Before reading research, you should be able to formulate ideas for and against. You should be intellectually honest, curious for knowledge. There are so many traits that are encompassed by a scientific perspective that I think can help move the industry forward, independent of one's understanding, of the research. Research is just a feature of science that helps us navigate throughout that space and, helps us better understand, what may work and what doesn't. It allows us to test and potentially disprove hypotheses. But at the end of the day, the scientific endeavor is a lot more than just research, and we have to keep that in mind when we are discussing these topics. I think science is the best tool we have to understand the roots of a topic and its application in practice. But when I say science, I'm not just referring to the research itself. Like I said, research is just a feature of that scientific endeavor. And, if an individual is not in a position to have a scientific discussion whilst employing those traits, it's very hard to have a productive discussion about the topic. And this sometimes makes, responding to comments and critiques quite difficult. So I think if there's one thing that, we can all do going forward to improve our understanding of, fitness-related topics, is to simply try and adopt some of these scientific traits. And, research and reading research can help you navigate that scientific space. But I think before one gets to that point, there are a whole host of other boxes that need to be ticked that will allow for, these productive discussions that actually improve our understanding of topics instead of making us more confused. I feel like sometimes these discussions can lead to confusion, and that's probably because they just lack scientific integrity, really. And, this comes back to all the traits that I mentioned earlier. So hopefully that makes sense as well. And I think I'd love to be involved in more scientific discussions as we are doing today to try and improve our understanding of fitness related ideas.
That's why we got you on, Martin. And I will say that this is invariably a topic that brings up an emotional response, and I think we can't get away from that, because I've said this many times, and it's not just a minor comment. It is a true belief of mine that identity related to being in the bodybuilding space is not necessarily about how big you are or anything like that. These objective outcomes, certainly that is part of it. I don't even think it's as much rooted in the mainstream in masculinity anymore, like it used to be, because it's become much more egalitarian, and you can see there's far more participation by women in the sport and in the practice, which I think is fantastic. But the one thing that has been a tried and true identity characteristic, if you look all the way back to the history, is effort and working as hard as you can. And this has been something that I think is any hint or sniff that there is something other than pushing yourself to your limit and then equating the fact that you're working as hard as you can with reaching your potential is to some degrees, and for some people, an existential threat, whether they realize it or not, because they have found meaning, they have found identity, they have found purpose, and they've benefited in many cases from understanding that if I put X in, I get X out. And even if I'm not someone who's doing social comparisons and all that, I have improved because I've put in work, and the message and the benefit and the whole reason people should be doing bodybuilding is self-improvement and hard work. So if you even give any hint that doing something that I don't actually think is, but could be perceived as not working quite as hard and getting an outcome, I think you're going to get some of these emotional responses from people. And when you get those emotional responses, when you have almost a religious zeal, like you will sometimes see in people in the HIIT community, the pendulum swings really hard at people who are trying to view it differently, and then they unfortunately kind of respond in kind. So like the people who are responding to being told, hey, just work harder, wuss, they will then come back and call, oh, those people are stupid, HIIT people are cultists. And it turns into this ideological war. So one thing that I think you should actually be encouraged by, Martin, is that I saw both pro-failure and anti-failure people posting about the article and making it fit their biases. And someone might post a bit from the abstract that is a little less nuanced and or apart from the conclusion, and it's there, throwing down the gauntlet at the other side and saying, hey, look, science is on our side. And I think when you can take an analysis like we've done, which the entire research question is based on the idea that this shouldn't be dichotomous, and we're addressing the limitation of viewing a non-dichotomous thing in a dichotomous way, and they managed to bring it back to a black and white view that supports both sides of an opposing false dichotomy, you can be sure that it's probably not your fault. So we got that out of the way. People decided that they needed to have their undergarments in so many twists, and that their jimmies were beyond ruffled, feathers floating everywhere, lots of puffed up birds yelling at each other, and now we're at the stage where people have come to accept that they had an emotional response. They threw their toys, but now they've got their banky, and those people have found a way to look at the data such that they can maintain their worldview. And those of us who maybe want to consider that there actually might be changes to worldviews, or that worldviews are fluid, and that none of us have an objective view of truth, but we can get closer to it by asking the right questions and using the philosophical perspective you provided. We can have chats now. So, yeah.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think, what we're trying to do is reason to find out, not reason to win. And I think that is probably the cornerstone of the scientific endeavor.
It sounds like a loser's mentality to me.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Yeah. So, it's common to hear people say, for example, ask, should you train to failure or not to failure, or what is the best RIR to train at? But those aren't the questions we are trying to endorse. These are dichotomous and non-practical questions. We're trying to endorse questions that are contextual, that are adaptive, right? So how can we use this knowledge? How can we use this information to employ proximity to failure in practice and get enough out of each of our sets, but limit any potential drawbacks? That's the question that we're trying to ask. And it's important to consider that as you read through our work, and hopefully it's clear in our work that that's what we're trying to get at. We're not trying to say that one approach is better than the other. We're just trying to put this research forward so that we can extract some information from it and then use that information in practice when we are considering the principles of how adaptations are driven on the gym floor and our understanding of how things work. And you really do, as a coach, as an individual who is training yourself, you really do have to consider all of that, and being hyper focused on any one variable is a great way to bottleneck your long-term progress. So hopefully that also makes sense, and the listeners and the readers of the articles can see that perspective coming through as they read through the text.
Omar, I'm on not only an ivory tower, but it's an ivory tower of saltiness. Like it's salt, like I'm standing on, as you can tell by our responses. So you don't have skin in the game. You weren't a published author on this. I know you defend me to the death, but am I wrong for being on this tower of saltiness, or do you think that I've accurately gauged some of the souls of my compatriots, which, by the way, I identify with? Don't get me wrong. I mean, I literally had the incredibly cringy nickname, the Relentless Warrior, when I was early in my bodybuilding career.
Really?
That's not a joke. No, there was a video made about it, everything.
I love it.
And I was so proud to be called the Relentless Warrior.
It is a good nickname.
Shout out.
I'm not gonna lie.
It's if you're a C grade WWF non-superstar,
Yeah.
it's 100%.
Yeah.
It's not the Ultimate Warrior. He gets beat a lot, but he doesn't stop.
Yeah, relentless.
So, yeah.
I have to be perfectly transparent, Eric. I love you, but you and Martin are sounding like a couple pencil necks that don't train hard enough. You're needlessly complicating things, and it's really simple. You're using this, basically this mirage, this illusion of talking about science and yada yada yada, and you're just not willing to put in the effort. And that, my friends, is unfortunately what, Martin, you're saying. When you engage in a conversation with someone who's in bad faith, in poor faith, you'll progress nowhere. And unfortunately, Eric, what you said, I was going to pause it right there. I think you're 100% correct. If we backpedal about 5 to 8 minutes, the real reason, it has to do with identity. And this sounds like why are we even having this conversation of either identity or personal belief or one's philosophical underpinnings of how they define themselves and the world around them. But it really is all tethered together. I think a lot of it has to do with exceptionalism, the notion that if I do something, I will get this outcome. I put in the hard work. It's kind of the foundation that our institutions are based off of here, that I do A, I'm going to receive B. And it's the great equalizer, because there are no inequalities in our life. Our inequalities are by our merit of our effort that we put in. So the fact that you want something and I don't have it, I must just simply work harder. You're bigger than me. Well, the reason you're bigger than me, or the reason I'm bigger than you, is because of the effort I put in. And I think one of the things, Eric, the unfortunate aspect, you toe the line when it comes to lifting in general, because no one knows what your genetics are, your natural propensity to build muscle, strength, so on and so forth. We don't know these things, so I think it's fine to be cautiously optimistic, but that is not synonymous with having an invincible ceiling, like a lack of a ceiling that anything is possible for you and you can achieve everything if you just work hard enough. And those people that talk about that idea, that identity of how they should train, and it's more a personal belief than it is a core training concept. Because to your point, Eric, I will say this: some of the people I've observed that would absolutely identify with I train to failure, or training to failure is important, or hard effort or whatnot, if you were to actually quantify their RIR compared to some of the studies, exactly what you said, I would venture a huge bet that a good portion of their training would not actually be to failure. It would be low RIR probably, or in some cases, it's more their mindset that they're entering, that they're willing to do whatever it takes, rather than an objective amount or objective rigid plan. But all I want to say just quickly is that I think it's an inability to reconcile the fact that while we don't know what anyone's potential is, everyone's potential is different. And if all other things are equal, if we all applied the same methodology, sound methodology and principles to our training, nutrition we followed, we adhere to it, and we maximize our own potential given the constraints that we had, we would see an unequal and inequalities in distribution when it comes to muscle mass due to limb lengths, proportions, again, natural propensity to build muscle. And that is disturbing to know that no matter what you do, there will be differences. And so I think Eric, if I had to say, just the only thing I wanted to add on top, because I 100% agree, man, is that it's an inability to recognize that there's differences in outcome, even when efforts applied the same, that could rustle their worldview, that essentially the world is theirs, or it's as it should be because it's elegantly constructed in a way that's neat and easy to understand. There is no chaos. I can understand it because I therefore can control it.
It's the just world fallacy,
Yeah.
you know, which is such a, in some ways it comes from a place, like a well-intentioned place. Like, I want the world to make sense. I want people to get what they deserve because you believe in things like equal opportunity or equality. But it leads to some pretty crazy stuff. I think one of the harder things to understand in psychology, and I will get off of my my non-expert perspective on things that are not RPE and protein pretty soon, I promise. When you see it on social media, for example, victim blaming, you know, some people's knee-jerk response to why was this person assaulted is, well, what did they do wrong? What did they do to deserve that? And my knee-jerk response to that person's knee-jerk response is to think, oh, they're just a terrible person. But I don't think that's it, because when I can notice victim blaming in myself when it does happen, I can identify that it comes from a place of, I don't want to live in a world where people get assaulted or discriminated against. So therefore, I need to mean this is an outlier occurrence, and they did something to either cause that or deserve it. And that's only one step away from some really shitty ideologies or worldviews when you think about it. But it is a very, very human and understandable thing to do. And I think that ties into this as well, to be honest.
Eric.
Martin thought he was going to come on and talk about p-values. And we're actually talking about
the heart and soul,
the fabric of society is what's happening.
Eric, one question, I want to pose one question to you and Martin too. I'm very curious, just when it comes to any sport, any athletic endeavor, I don't think you would hear those trite platitudes that you hear in bodybuilding and also powerlifting. I find it notable that many powerlifters self-identify with the person who they weren't naturally gifted. They had to work hard for what they got. But if you were to interview any sport, if you're a shot putter, anything that requires either like power, athleticism, doesn't matter, a sprinter, you will not hear, you won't hear Usain Bolt say, I started off as a kid, couldn't really run fast. I just really started training very hard and I just became faster. It's not part of their core identity. I'm just curious from both of you, because I think that's the tail end of that conversation, Martin. We're going to get back to it, but I think it's relevant because it's why this question is relevant about training to failure and what it means, the implications. But why do you think, I'll first start with Eric and Martin, I want to hear your thoughts on this. Why do you think that it's only within essentially bodybuilding, at least what I've observed, and powerlifting, those domains, that athletes will choose to identify, or it's part of their narrative that they weren't gifted, and it's largely through their effort that they've accrued those benefits? Sprinters don't have it. Shot putters, go to decathletes. It doesn't matter. You just do not hear that on the national or international level.
Man, I think it comes from a combination of, I'll take a historical lens.
Yeah.
If you go back to the roots of bodybuilding, pre it being a well-defined, like today, it's still a niche sport, but bodybuilding and powerlifting came from the same place. Bodybuilding and powerlifting came from weightlifting, and actually bodybuilding sort of came from weightlifting, if you think about the history of it, where it was done the day after some of these national competitions, and it was seen as your health and your performance and your physique were all coming from the same thing, right? Your physique is the display of the result of your training type of deal. So they all had the same, physical culture origins. And if you look at the marketing that existed once physical culture started to become an industry in the 1900s and late 1800s, like how many strongmen and like mostly strongmen at the time, if we're talking about this historical era, their stories all were born a sickly kid, or I was a 90-pound weakling. In high school I only weighed this, and I think that probably wasn't true in many of these cases, but it was a way to make it seem astonishing, because these were, again, circus acts, and to show like just the indomitable human spirit. And then many people were getting into this due to insecurity sometimes, when it was much more closely tied to masculinity. I think that's a huge part of it. And then as soon as the marketing got ramped up around that and that became identified, it was leveraged. Like when you look at the Charles Atlas stuff and the, like, we're talking like ad copy that is 80 to 100 years old. It is always comes down to, oh, are you a 90-pound weakling? Here's how you can change yourself, So I think it's those roots, because that really isn't that long ago when you think about it. And while we are today in a space, like I said, where, of course, there's plenty of people that equate their masculinity to lifting and things like that, I don't think it's the norm anymore. And I think, and it's really obvious when it is. People have like alpha in their name and things like that. I know that shot fired at like 100 people, but honestly, it's super cringe. Sorry. Yeah. So when there's people who are clearly compensating for being like, they were small or they were short or they were bullied, like I'm not belittling someone for having this as a way of dealing with that. I think it's probably a healthy adaptive thing, except when it's not, when they kind of carry that through thread philosophically of dealing with that insecurity. I think that's what it's being reflected in. And one thing where you typically don't see it is in people who were athletes in another sport and then came over to powerlifting or came over to bodybuilding. Yep. They have a level of what I would say is true confidence rather than compensatory performative confidence. I think honestly, like Russ Orhey is a great example. Like, he's not arrogant, but he's incredibly confident. He came into the sport and he was looking at it in a different way than most people. Not like, how do I get to a point where I'm no longer embarrassed and then I'm surprised by the fact that I was actually good? He was like, all right, what are good people squatting right now? Let me get at that, Yep. And I've even commented on Iron Culture before how that's a different take than most people. Like, he brings a certain competitiveness looking at other people. And we've had, Ellis McLean, Taylor Atwood, Russ Orhey. We've had a lot of people who were very successful athletes who then came into powerlifting and found that they were even more successful here. And they don't have that. They're much more akin to what you were describing, Omar, of athletes from other sports, where they don't need this narrative of I've overcome all this, They're a little more professional and clinical about it, I guess you could say.
Love it. Martin.
Yeah, those are all really good points. I probably haven't thought about that question enough to have a really informed opinion, but I think the hardworking mentality, it's appealing to people, and it's motivating to see others work really hard, and the notion that you have to push harder to get better results. Like I said, that in itself is motivating to see. So people leverage that. My only concern is that some people, like the individuals who are scrolling through Instagram and watching others work hard, and these people are under the impression that maybe they need to train harder to build more muscle and make more progress. But my concern is that what many people may think is hard training is actually counterproductive. So yes, we have to make training harder, and we need to put a lot of effort into our training to get great results. But I'll give you guys a great example. Like, I've competed in bodybuilding twice, and I now coach many bodybuilders, and I've had some bodybuilders come to me with a previous training experience with another coach who has made them do twice a day training, 6-7 days a week, hours and hours of cardio every day to get them the results that they want. And that is brutal. That's training really hard, and clearly the coach in that context is under the impression that you simply just need to work harder to get better results. And what I've done is I've taken that approach and I've distilled it, and I've arguably made the client work less hard, but they have gotten better results. Now, this is where you have to elucidate the term hard. I'm not sure if many people understand what hard training really is for hypertrophy. Like, I can make a training program really, really hard. I can make clients do 100 reps on every exercise, on every set that they perform. And even looking at a program like that, for some people, it's like a selling point. Like, some people look at a program like that and be like, man, this is going to destroy me. And this is a good thing because I'm going to be working harder and I'm going to be getting better results. But arguably, that type of a program is counterproductive. So it's not just a matter of finding ways to just make a client train harder and to brutalize a client, on the gym floor. It's a matter of actually defining what hard means in the context of hypertrophy. And in the context of this discussion, well, we're using the term hard to describe proximity to failure, and the notion that you have to push close to failure to get good results. But that doesn't always mean that pushing harder is better for hypertrophy. That doesn't mean that taking all your sets to failure will be better for hypertrophy. Yes, it may be harder, and there's other ways we can also make training hard, but that isn't always going to translate to better results, right? Some people are under the impression that they need to spend hours in the gym, they need to be huffing and puffing, that they need to be, sweating bullets in the gym. But that's a counterproductive approach, arguably. And, that is one of my main concerns when we're using these terms like hard training and having to put in more effort into our training and having to make our training brutal. My concern is people are taking measures that in the long run are likely going to be counterproductive. And a great example is, the one I gave earlier where, I've had many clients who've come to me who've trained twice a day, 6-7 days a week, and, running themselves into the ground. But that doesn't necessarily always equate to getting better results. So for me, there seems to be a disconnect between what people think is hard, right, and what is actually hard and what is actually going to stimulate muscle hypertrophy in the long run to the best degree possible. And that's the disconnect that, I'm trying to clear up with my research and with these discussions. It's not just a matter of making training more brutal and making training harder. Yes, to some extent, that needs to be a piece of the puzzle, but we first need to understand what hard actually means in the context of whatever goal we're working towards. And, some people just simply have that understanding completely messed up. And in many cases, what they're doing on the gym floor to make training harder may be counterproductive, right? Yes, of course, it's going to stimulate some growth. It's going to stimulate some degree of progress. But I think we need to be more scientific about the way, we have these discussions as we are now, so that we can simply come to a better understanding and get people moving towards their goals in, arguably a more productive, a more sustainable, and a more realistic way.
I love it. Omar, I hope that answered your question. And it just reminds me, actually, Martin, of your presentation at the UEBC recently, where you were talking about how you can make your training feel harder, but actually be getting in the way of your own proximity to failure. So, and I presented some data on this in my presentation as well that just happened to link and support what you were saying. There's research, for example, comparing people training to failure at a 20 to 35 RM versus a 8 to 12 RM. And both of those are to a similar definition of failure. I'm not actually sure if they really well controlled for true proximity to failure, but they were both groups instructed to go to repetition maximum, right? So that would be a definition of failure, not momentary failure. The only difference is that one group is doing 8 to 12, and that's where they're hitting that point, and the other 20 to 35. And the session RPE, so the perceived exertion of the entire session, of a session composed of all 8 to 12 RMs versus 20 to 35 RMs, it's a full RPE point higher when going to that 20 to 35 RM. And if you link that up with the research that we've actually done out of Dr. Zerdos' lab, where there is a significant relationship in some studies between the number of reps in a set And the inaccuracy in predicting proximity to failure, even as high as a 9 RPE or as quote unquote low as a 1 RIR, meaning that in practice, if you're doing things that make training harder, and this is, again, a typical cultural holdover from decades and decades and decades of bodybuilding literature, a way to make training harder is reduce your rest interval, do higher reps. I've heard of Widowmakers. That's the idea of doing 3 sets of 20 squats or breathing squats. And the ironic thing is that doing these very high rep, high fatigue protocols, giant sets, drop sets, all this stuff, it's actually more likely, based upon the research that's out there, to make you over predict your proximity to failure, to think, oh, I'm actually at a 9 RPE when you might actually be at a 6, versus doing things in a more intelligent way and actually being at a 9 RPE, but you're training with an appropriate rep range for the exercise that you're using. So anyway, I'll leave it there. If you want to expand on that, feel free.
Yeah, I think that highlights the importance of understanding the difference between perceived discomfort and true proximities to failure. So I think a lot of people, walk into the gym and they obviously, start lifting weights, and once they feel that discomfort, they feel that burn in their muscles, they are under the impression that they're doing something right, they're on the right track, and that they're probably close to failure. And yeah, they may be on the right track, but the issue is when people start to confuse those perceptual feelings with how hard they are objectively working within each and every set that they perform. So, some people, I've spoken to some people who are under the impression, they're training to failure or they're training close to failure, and, they've been in the gym for a long period of time, and I watch them do their sets, and they're stopping their sets simply because of that discomfort that is starting to accumulate across, the repetitions that they perform. And there's many training methods that we can implement that come with a high degree of perceived discomfort that look hard on paper, right? And that, look honestly sometimes brutal on paper. But in many cases, people will execute these training methods, will execute these programs, and they're actually shortcutting themselves because they're terminating their sets prematurely without really understanding the difference between that perceived discomfort that starts to accumulate over the set and their true proximity to failure. So that's just another example of how there seems to be a disconnect between what people feel is hard, right, and what is objectively going to stimulate hypertrophy, which is also hard in its own regard. It's just a matter of clearly identifying, somewhat of a definition for that term hard. And, perceived discomfort is always going to be with us on the gym floor, but there are certain methods that we can implement that will help decrease the perceived discomfort experience and actually get clients closer to failure, which is arguably going to get them more hypertrophy. Now, it might not feel as hard as doing, 30 to 40 rep sets, but it's arguably more effective. And, I think that's one thing that, people that can really help someone advance their training is just simply understanding the difference between what feels hard, which may be perceived discomfort, and what is objectively going to get them to where they want to be, which is also hard in its own regard.
Well said. Omar, I feel like we've covered a lot of ground. And I think the next question I want to ask, unless there's something you want to touch on, is what the future of Martin, your PhD looks like, and where do we go from here? How do we get it in more nuance and specific questions, and maybe being able to give even more practical recommendations?
Yeah, so I think the first step is improved study designs that reflect what we do in practice. So one of my practical applications and an approach I take with a lot of my clients is varying the proximity to failure that they reach across all their sets. So when we look at a session as a whole, of course, a session is made up of different exercises which all have different demands on the body. Some exercises come with more fatigue than others. These exercises are going to be sequenced in a certain order. There's going to be, a certain amount of volume allocated to each of those exercises. A practical application that I usually promote is if you're starting off your sessions and you're doing a big compound exercise like a barbell squat, it's probably not in your best interest to be taking a barbell squat to a 0 or 1 RIR or to failure. It's probably a good idea to keep some reps in the tank if you know you have a leg press coming up and then maybe a leg extension after that. So the way I program for my clients is essentially a blend of failure and non-failure training. If I'm programming a leg session and I've got a client doing barbell squats followed by a leg press and then followed by a leg extension, the proximity to failure is going to change across the session. There's no reason you have to stick to the same RIR value for each of the exercises you perform and for each of the sets you perform. There's no reason that all of them need to be taken to failure. There's no reason for all of them to be not taken to failure. There's ways in which we can use this information to try and get enough out of each set, but limit any of those potential drawbacks that can come from pushing close to failure. One of those drawbacks is just the fatigue costs. And I've got some research that has just recently been submitted for publication that will better elucidate how proximity to failure influences neuromuscular fatigue. And the study design is quite novel in the sense that it will allow us to tease out the difference between training to failure, training to a perceived 1 RIR, and training to a perceived 3 RIR. So stay tuned if you're interested in that. But going back to the practical application, again, if I was to program that leg session, I'd keep a few reps in the tank on the barbell squat. I'd push the leg press closer to failure, so maybe 1 to 2 reps in reserve, and then the leg extension, we could probably push that all the way to failure, because the fatigue cost of that leg extension isn't really going to interfere with the session we're currently doing because it's the last exercise, right? So there's so many moving parts here that we have to be willing to consider when we're trying to interpret the results of research and integrate them into practice. That's just one way that I go about doing that. And, it's on the reader to have a framework of thinking that they can employ when they extract information from research so that they can use that information effectively in practice. It doesn't have to look exactly the way that I'm doing it, but there needs to be, some sort of a rationale and framework of thinking that helps them connect dots between different lines of research, different lines of understanding, so that they can, employ a method that is going to be sufficiently hard to get the client's results that they want, but isn't necessarily going to be counterproductive, right? So that's the way I would set up a training session, for example. And in the future, I want to put that to the test. So I want to see how that sort of a protocol design would, I want to see how that would match up with failure training, right? I want to put the two together, compare them, and see how a long-term intervention can affect train. I want to see how training to failure in the long run, how the results of that protocol may be different to a protocol that I would often employ in practice that doesn't dichotomize between failure and non-failure training, that simply employs various proximities to failure over the course of a session, based on understanding of how things work, based on our understanding of principles like progressive overload, fatigue management, and specificity. And that will give us a much clearer indication of the influence of proximity to failure on muscle hypertrophy. Because right now, a lot of the non-failure protocols, like I mentioned earlier, they're not as practical as they potentially could be, and we don't really know the specific effect of certain proximities to failure. And that's something that I want to elucidate in my future research, both, when it comes to short-term responses like fatigue. So stay tuned in the coming months for some more research to come through on that, but also, muscle hypertrophy. How can we better design a protocol that takes advantage of the information we currently have at hand and takes advantage of what we know? How can we design a protocol that may actually be better than momentary muscular failure, all the time? But of course, that may not be the result that we find. So really, like I mentioned earlier, to summarize the conclusions of our meta-analysis, right, they leave the door open for future research to weigh in. We're not closing the door on anything here. It's just a matter of bringing more research to the forefront of our minds, so that we can hopefully clarify a better understanding of how things work and clarify a better understanding of the topic at hand. But of course, we still need more research in the future to piece the puzzle together. And that's what I'm going to be looking to do in the coming years.
Fabulous.
Martin, absolutely love it. And you actually answered basically the question that I was going to ask, which is essentially for someone who's interested in all this, who's been listening, that from the outset you said the goal of this meta-analysis isn't to answer any one person's specific questions, but it's how to better frame all these considerations to inform their training. And you just gave a fantastic example, man. So I think this has been a pleasant surprise having you on, having this discussion, deviating as we always do into a little sub conversation. But I do think it's important because when we talk about the scientific process and coming up with a hypothesis, it's like, where does this originate from? Like, where does this come from in the first place? The popularity of training failure, or the discussion around it. So it is cool to discuss that. I will say very briefly that we'll make sure to link in the description all your socials, just as we did where we shouted out NASM and so forth. We got Kai on the job. Is there anything you want to say just before we close it out? Or anything you want to circle back to now that we've kind of reached the conclusion? I think you wrapped that up perfectly. But just before we do, anything else you want to say in closing?
Yeah, I think whenever new research comes out, be sure to take your time, if you're a reader of research, to pay attention to the wording used before you jump the gun and come to a conclusion or your own personal interpretation of the research findings. Take a step back, read the paper, and see how it fits in to the overarching understanding of what we currently know. And I think that can go a long way in itself, especially if you have the perspective of reasoning to find out, not reasoning to win. And when it comes to the specific context of what I'm researching and the recent meta-analysis that we put forth, like I said, I saw a lot of misinterpretations of the findings. Indeed, in our practical application section, we actually speak about how you can employ training to failure in your program, which has never been done from my knowledge in previous research. Most research has simply concluded that there is no difference between failure and non-failure training. We didn't want to take that route because we don't think it is the ideal conclusion, and we actually provided practical recommendations for people to actually employ failure training in their own program. So by no means are we being dichotomous between failure and non-failure training. It's just a matter of taking a step back, not jumping the gun, reading the paper, and actually understanding what the findings truly mean. So hopefully people understand that and can keep that in mind going forward. And like I said earlier, what we're trying to do is we're trying to ask better questions that are contextual, that are adaptive, and that are practical, and we're trying to answer them scientifically. And that doesn't just mean we're using the research. There are a whole host of other traits that encompass a scientific perspective. And I think if we can all try and adopt and employ these traits in practice, the understanding of fitness-related ideas is going to improve in the long run, and we'll be better able to move the industry forward and just gain a better understanding of how things work. Again, instead of just making people more confused, because I think that the way some people approach conversations and discussions in fitness can cause more confusion. And hopefully in the coming years, I can contribute to these scientific discussions alongside you guys and alongside a bunch of other great scientists and upcoming researchers and just practitioners in the field who also have many, great things to say. And, hopefully that can move the industry forward.
Love it. I just want to give a shout out to you, Martin. I want to give a shout out to Arnie in the back. Like I said, we'll link your socials down below for everyone to check out. I also want to thank, lastly, the entire Iron Culture for listening to another scintillating episode. You go ahead and leave a rating review on iTunes. There were 2 more, Eric, that we will read at another time. But 5 stars typically, Martin, is what people give. We allow you to reach and form your own conclusions. We firmly believe that. We're merely informing you. It's like, oh, you want to go to this restaurant. Of course, you ask your friend, what's the Yelp rating or the Google review or whatnot, because you just want to know, is it worth your time? So people are giving 5 stars on average, which means that if your opinion differentiates from that, likely you're the outlier and the problem is with you, not us. Anyways, we're back every single Monday from now until the end of time. We'll catch you in that next episode.